The dimly lit sign flickered ominously in the night, casting an eerie glow over the deserted parking lot of the old motel. The paint on the building was peeling, and the windows were clouded with age. It was the kind of place that whispered stories of forgotten travelers, of people who checked in but whose presence seemed to linger long after they'd departed. The kind of place where the walls themselves seemed to remember every sob, every scream, every final breath drawn in the dark hours before dawn. The wind howled softly through the parking lot, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, as if nature itself was trying to warn anyone who dared to enter. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the buildings settling into the night. This was the Wayside Inn, though the locals had long ago stopped calling it by that name. They had other names for it now, names spoken in hushed tones. A lone figure, Sarah, pulled into the parking lot, her headlights illuminating the cracked pavement. She had been driving for hours, pushing through the night to reach her sister's wedding on the coast, and exhaustion tugged at her eyelids with an almost physical force. The motel was a last resort, a place to rest before continuing her journey at dawn. Every other establishment for 50 miles had displayed no vacancy signs. As she stepped out of her car, a chill ran down her spine, but she brushed it off as fatigue and the cool night air. She grabbed her overnight bag and made her way toward the office. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed overhead as she approached the check-in desk, where an elderly man with a weathered face greeted her with a faint smile. His eyes seemed to hold a depth of knowledge, as if he had seen too much in his lifetime. He moved slowly as he retrieved a key from the board behind him. "Room 13, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that brief connection, Sarah could have sworn she saw something there. Pity, perhaps. Or was it warning? After receiving her key, Sarah made her way to room 13, the door creaking open as she stepped inside. The room was small, with faded wallpaper that might have once been cheerful but now seemed to sag with despair. A musty odor lingered in the air, the smell of countless cigarettes, cheap cleaning products, and something else. Something she couldn't quite identify. Something that made her stomach turn slightly. A single bed sat against the wall, the sheets wrinkled and uninviting. The bedspread a garish floral pattern that had faded to ghostly pastels. As she dropped her bag on the floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The room had an oppressive quality, as if the air itself was heavier here, pressing down on her chest and making each breath require conscious effort. An old television sat on a dresser, its screen reflecting the room in dark, distorted angles. The mirror above the dresser was spotted and cloudy, and for a moment Sarah thought she saw movement in its reflection. But when she turned, there was nothing there. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more tales of the supernatural, make sure to subscribe to Whispers Beyond. We explore the shadows where the living and the dead intersect, bringing you stories that will make you question what lies just beyond the veil. Dismissing her unease, she decided to take a shower to wash away the weariness of the road and the strange atmosphere that seemed to cling to her skin. The bathroom was cramped, with outdated fixtures and tiles that had yellowed with age. As the hot water cascaded down her back, Sarah felt a moment of relief, but that comfort was short-lived. She heard a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the water. The voice was faint, like a distant echo carried on a wind that shouldn't exist within these walls. She froze, the shampoo bottle slipping from her grasp and crashing to the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Heart racing, she turned off the water and stepped out, wrapping a towel around herself with trembling hands. The room felt colder now, and the air seemed to thicken with an unseen presence, as if someone had just passed through, leaving behind their essence, their desperation. Gathering her courage, she opened the bathroom door, peering into the dimly lit room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of dread hung heavy in the air, wrapping around her like a cold, wet blanket. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 2:47 a.m., though Sarah could have sworn only minutes had passed since she'd entered the room. Time itself seemed unreliable here, stretched and distorted by forces she couldn't comprehend. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, she decided to investigate. She pulled on her clothes quickly, no longer wanting to be vulnerable, and stepped into the hallway. The motel was eerily quiet, and she wandered down to the lobby where the old man still sat behind the desk, engrossed in a book so ancient its pages had yellowed to the color of old bone. The light from his desk lamp cast strange shadows on his face, making his features seem to shift and change as she approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to sound calm. "Is this place haunted?" The man looked up slowly as if he'd been expecting this question all along. His expression was unreadable, a mask worn smooth by years of watching guests come and go, by years of answering questions he could never truly answer. "Many have come and gone," he said finally, his voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "But not all leave the same way they arrived. Some check out, some just disappear, and some never really leave at all." "What do you mean?" she pressed, taking a step closer to the desk. But he merely returned to his book, his finger tracing lines of text she couldn't make out from where she stood. The conversation was over, leaving her with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that she had made a terrible mistake by staying here. As night deepened, Sarah returned to her room, her heart pounding with anxiety. She sat on the edge of the bed, contemplating her next move. Perhaps she should just get back in her car and drive through the night. The wedding wasn't until late afternoon tomorrow. She could make it. She could be away from this place and its oppressive atmosphere. But exhaustion weighed on her like a physical force, and her eyes kept drifting closed despite her fear. Suddenly the lights flickered and she heard the whisper again, clearer this time, more urgent. "Help me, find me." The voice was desperate, filled with sorrow so profound it seemed to press against Sarah's chest, making her heart ache with a grief that wasn't her own. There was something in that voice, something that called to her on a level beyond rational thought. It was the sound of a soul in torment, reaching out across the barriers of death for someone, anyone, who might hear and respond. Compelled by an unseen force, by something deeper than curiosity or even empathy, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside. The cool air enveloped her as she walked toward the back of the motel where the shadows seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. The moon had risen higher now, casting everything in stark silver light that somehow made the darkness seem even darker by comparison. There she spotted a dilapidated shed, its door slightly ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. As she approached, the temperature dropped dramatically, her breath now coming in thick clouds that hung in the still air. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over her, a primal warning from some ancient part of her brain that screamed at her to run, to get away, to leave this place and never look back. But the voice called to her again, and she found her feet moving forward despite every instinct telling her to flee. Inside the shed, she found old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs that hung like curtains from the ceiling. Broken chairs, a rusted bed frame, cardboard boxes that had long ago collapsed under the weight of time and moisture. The beam from her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing forgotten remnants of lives once lived. But in the corner, something materialized. A figure, translucent and shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement. A woman, her face twisted in anguish, her mouth open in a silent scream that had echoed through decades. "Help me," she pleaded, tears streaming down her ghostly cheeks, leaving trails of light in the darkness. Sarah's heart raced as she realized this was no ordinary spirit. This was a soul trapped in torment, seeking release from whatever bound her to this place, to this shed behind a forgotten motel on a stretch of highway that most people drove past without a second glance. With trembling hands, Sarah reached out, though her fingers passed through nothing but cold air that seemed to crackle with energy. "I'm here to help you," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. The ghost's expression softened, and for a brief moment, the air shimmered with hope, with the possibility of peace after so many years of suffering. "Find my remains," she whispered before fading into the shadows. The shed, which had been filled with an almost electric presence just moments before, now felt empty and lifeless once more. But Sarah had heard her. Sarah understood. Determined, she searched the shed, her flashlight beam sweeping across every surface, probing every corner. The smell of decay and old wood filled her nostrils, but she pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose she'd never felt before. She moved aside boxes, pushed away ancient furniture, her fingers growing dirty and scratched from her efforts. And then, in the far corner beneath a pile of moldering canvas tarps, she found it. A loose floorboard. Her heart hammering in her chest, Sarah pried up the board with a piece of broken chair leg, the old wood splintering and giving way with a sound like a sigh. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small, weathered box, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it had been undisturbed for decades. With shaking hands, she lifted it free and opened the lid. Inside was a tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain, and a note, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written in desperation. Sarah carefully unfolded it, squinting to read the faded ink by the light of her flashlight. The note revealed a name, Margaret Hartwell, and told a story of betrayal and murder. Margaret had worked at the motel in 1963, a young woman saving money for nursing school. She had witnessed something she shouldn't have, something involving the motel owner's illegal activities. She'd threatened to go to the police, and for that, she had paid the ultimate price. The note was her final message, hidden in the moments before she died, a desperate attempt to ensure that someone someday would know the truth. She had been killed and buried in the shed, her disappearance explained away as a girl who'd simply run off to the city like so many others had done. No investigation, no questions, just another forgotten soul in a world that moved too fast to notice when someone vanished. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read Margaret's words, feeling the weight of injustice that had gone unanswered for over 60 years. With newfound purpose, she vowed to give the woman the peace she deserved, to ensure that Margaret Hartwell's story was finally told, that her death was not in vain. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah left the motel, but not before she'd made several phone calls. First to the local police, then to a historical society, and finally to a newspaper reporter who specialized in cold cases. The weight of the spirit's sorrow had lifted, and though Sarah was exhausted beyond measure, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment, of rightness. If stories like this captivate you, if you want to explore more encounters with the supernatural and the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding, subscribe to Whispers Beyond. We bring you the stories that haunt the spaces between the living and the dead, the tales that refuse to be forgotten. Later that week, Sarah would learn that the motel had indeed been the site of criminal activity in the 60s, run by a man named Earl Wayside who had used it as a front for smuggling operations. Margaret's remains were found exactly where her note said they would be, buried beneath the shed floor. She was finally laid to rest in a proper cemetery, her name cleared, her story told. The motel itself was demolished shortly after, the land sold to a developer who built a small park in its place. A memorial stone now marks the spot, bearing Margaret's name and the dates of her too short life. But some say that on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear a woman's voice carried on the breeze. Not a cry for help anymore, but something different. Something that sounds almost like gratitude, like relief. Like a soul finally free after decades of waiting for someone to hear her story. And Sarah, who continued on to her sister's wedding and eventually returned to her normal life, never forgot that night. She never forgot the voice in the darkness, the desperate plea for help, or the feeling of giving a restless spirit the peace she'd been denied for so long. The truth is, there are places all across this country where the past refuses to stay buried, where the dead reach out to the living with messages that need to be heard. The old Wayside Inn was one such place, and Margaret Hartwell was one such soul. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the living owe a debt to the dead, and sometimes, in the darkness of a forgotten motel room, in the whisper of a voice that shouldn't exist, we're given the chance to pay that debt and to set right what was once made wrong. These are the moments that change us, that make us believe there's something more beyond what we can see and touch, something that binds us all together across the boundaries of life and death.